You might have recognized that very famous tune there. It is the first section of a larger piece by Richard Strauss called Also Spoke Zarathustra, or translated into English, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the reason it didn't sound very good is because that was a 1944 recording of Richard Strauss actually conducting it, the author. And the song was obviously inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical novel, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Friedrich Nietzsche died, I think it was in 1900, so he would have still been alive when Strauss first performed this in public in 1896. So obviously Strauss was a big fan of whatever Friedrich Nietzsche was saying in there. This story famously contains the phrase, God is dead, which was a very provocative thing to say at that time. And interestingly, if you're a fan of Black Sabbath, their very last album, which is entitled 13, the first song on it is called God is Dead, with a question mark next to it. That first part is called Sunrise. Became well known after its use in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that's the place a lot of people may have heard that song. It's very dramatic. We see planets moving and the sun emerging. We'll look at that in a moment. Now I'm going to play for you a more contemporary version of this song so you can really hear everything and see the musicians, what they're doing and such, and you get much more of the impact of it. And I'm going to do what I'm calling an emotional diagram while this is playing. And if you're wondering what the hell that is, well, I'm going to explain it, but it's probably going to be self-explanatory when you see it. Now, you don't have to be a big classical music buff or, a musician understanding the technicality of what's going on here. You don't really need to understand any of that to recognize the power that a conductor has over a performance like this. And you can even see his hands there. He almost looks like he's a wizard and he's going to cast some, shoot some lightning bolts out of his fingers or something. And if you think about it, he is powerful because what is he doing? What is the orchestra actually doing? Well, as you saw, I notated the feelings I associated with each section. And what is a song if not a journey of feelings? Maybe it makes you feel a certain way. Maybe it takes you through different emotions, takes you through sort of a roller coaster, almost like the way a movie entertains you. Music can entertain you in the same way, but it can make you feel a certain way. And it's almost as if this conductor presses a button and goes, now you feel fear. Now you feel happiness. Now you feel sadness. So I want you to think of it in those terms. And so right here at about the first 18 seconds or so, we get these low rumbling sounds, almost like not even notes but sounds, but they are notes. They're just very low, and you see the timpani drums sort of rumbling with it, and then the cellos kind of wiggling like that, just real low notes. Now, why does that create a feeling of fear and impending doom? What does that feeling come from? Well, if you think of like an earthquake, or I don't know, a huge ship, the metal creaking on a ship. These types of sounds, they're unsettling. I mean, they rumble our bodies. A car comes along and it's booming bass, and you can hear it 3 blocks away. A Harley Davidson revs, and it revs, down the highway, and you hear it you feel like minutes after it's leaving, you still hear it. Those low frequencies, they have an effect on our body, and they grab your attention, and there's a certain menace to it. And you can see it reflected in his face. And then now the horns come in, and these sort of indicate like a buildup. Something's building up, something's coming. So the kind of doom, impending doom and awe and power of those low subfrequencies is now being complemented by this approaching feel of kind of awe and build up to something. There's some kind of climax coming. So, whatever impending doom was being indicated by the sub-frequencies is now approaching. You can see it clearly. It's coming towards you. And then they all play really loudly, and here it is. Whatever that first wave was, it just crashed. So I guess, if you sort of imagine you're on a ship on rough waters, that was the first big wave that just smashed you. Perhaps gave the boat a good whack, but you don't, you're not going down yet, but you're like, whoa, what was that? That's, there's a feeling of awe and power and terror. And then it kind of winds down again, and then we start over. And the horns kind of bring it back again. They bring it to a climax. But this time, the climax hits kind of a little more of a counter note that's a bit more, I guess you could say, hopeful. So there's an opposing force to this terror, but it's all very grandiose. But there's a feeling of like a power of darkness being met with just a hint of light. And it winds down again. And here we go one more time. And now they speed up a little bit. And this time, major notes kind of take over, and it has a little more of a grandiose feeling of victory, of just powerful victory on a grand scale. And I guess it makes sense that this would be the sound of perhaps the sun rising out of darkness. And that's what the movement is called. It's called Sunrise. And here we have footage from the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you can see it starts with darkness, and then the light pierces the darkness by way of the sun shining over these planets. So you've got the impending doom of the vast, endless darkness, but then you have this great, powerful, piercing light off in the distance, which represents that opposing force in the music. So it's perfect. It's a perfect music video. And if you think in terms of the occult and Luciferianism, the Luciferians, they worship the sun, Lucifer, light. This is the greatest God there is in the known universe. And as I said earlier, it's based on the Spoke Zarathustra. And that first section talks about how God is dead. And if God is dead, then the Lord of Light is the Lord of all, the Lord of this world. So why was Richard Strauss so obsessed with this piece of writing to the point where he needed to write this great masterpiece after it? Well, we're going to read the synopsis of that first section, Sunrise, that piece of music is based upon. So the book begins with a prologue which sets up many of the themes that will be explored throughout the work. Zarathustra is introduced as a hermit who has lived 10 years on a mountain with his two companions, an eagle and a serpent. One morning, inspired by the sun, which is happy only when it shines upon others, Zarathustra decides to return to the world and share his wisdom. Upon descending the mountain, he encounters a saint living in a forest, who spends his days praising God. Zarathustra marvels that the saint has not yet heard that God is dead. So if we just stop there for a moment, okay, he's a hermit who's lived for 10 years on a mountain with his two companions. So everything's symbolic here. So if you think in terms of the hermit in the tarot card, something along those lines, the old man, holding the lantern, he's getting knowledge. He's been enlightened. He's gaining some kind of enlightenment. And he's hanging out with an eagle and a serpent. There's lots of birds of prey in ancient Egyptian mythology. Eagles can see very well from very far away, and they're birds of prey. They're very effective predators. And serpent, of course, ancient Egypt as well, representing knowledge, right? And in the biblical sense, the tempter, the beguiler of Eve. And one morning, inspired by the sun. So the sun plays a very strong role here in the symbology. So Zarathustra has been enlightened by the sun and wants to share this wisdom. If you think in terms of Freemasonry and Luciferianism, this all fits right in very well. It would be very easy to believe that Friedrich Nietzsche and Strauss were probably Freemasons, but I have no idea if they were. Zarathustra marvels that the saint has not yet heard that God is dead. So let's move on. Arriving at the nearest town, Zarathustra addresses a crowd which is gathered to watch a tightrope walker. He tells them that mankind's goal must be to create something superior to itself, a new type of human, the Übermensch. All men, he says, must be prepared to will their own destruction in order to bring the Übermensch into being. The crowd greets this speech with scorn and mockery, and meanwhile the tightrope show begins. When the rope dancer is halfway across, a clown comes up behind him, urging him to get out of the way. The clown then leaps over the rope dancer, causing the latter to fall to his death. The crowd scatters. Zarathustra takes the corpse of the rope dancer on his shoulders, carries it into the forest, and lays it in a hollow tree. He decides that from this point on, he will no longer attempt to speak to the masses, but only to a few chosen disciples. There follows a series of discourses in which Zarathustra overturns many of the precepts of Christian morality. He gathers a group of disciples, but ultimately abandons them, saying that he will not return until they have disowned him. So what is all this? There's so much in there. You got the concept of the Übermensch, which Adolf Hitler was obsessed with, and creating the superior man by destroying yourself. How does that work? I think that means destroying your conception of yourself, which I guess means attacking some of the most basic principles that are the building blocks of what your character are, which meaning religion, I guess, Christianity. And this thing about the tightrope walker and the clown. The clown could possibly represent, like a jester or the fool in the tarot, if we're thinking in terms of occult symbolism. The fool, is seen walking off of a ledge or floating out into nowhere, jumping into nothingness, which is, like a foolish jump, or in another sense, you could say a leap of faith. But he doesn't really know where he's going, so he has the potential to go everywhere, to be anything at any time. But at the same time, there's a certain carefree attitude to it all. And one of the consequences of that can be, jumping on a bed of nails, or perhaps even causing someone else to fall to their death, is in a way that was described here. This superior knowledge that he was trying to impart, similar to how Jesus would address a crowd of people, this actually caused someone to die. And so this told him, well, I need to only share this with a few people that can handle it, because if I just shoot my mouth off everywhere, it'll, people die. So again, this makes me think of Freemasons and the secrecy and the secret oaths and all this, and only chosen people are, to have the information. I think it's probably playing off the Bible a little bit, but obviously there's a thing about turning Christianity on its head specifically. And this whole will to power thing, I mean, it's just so perfect with Luciferianism and a lot of that occultism we come to associate with the Illuminati. Ultimately, this video is a supplemental to a larger project I'm working on, where I'm looking at the way that music specifically and intentionally affects people's behavior. And, they say if you want to defeat your enemy, you have to understand and think like your enemy. And, you might look around and see all the chaos in the world and all the violence and hatred, and, you might think it's hopeless. So what can I do? It's just too much. I can't understand it. Where do I start? I'm not an insider. What can I do? Well, what we can do is we can look at what they're putting in our faces, and we can analyze it and trace it back to its origin. And when you do this, the outline of the enemy becomes clearer and you can see what you're dealing with. And one last point I want to make before closing this out, when I speak about the enemy and the great oppressor, I'm not saying that Strauss, was some kind of evil wizard. I'm not saying Strauss is the enemy. I'm not necessarily saying Friedrich Nietzsche is the enemy. And I'm not saying that Stanley Kubrick is the enemy. What I'm saying is they were chosen. Their art was elevated because they were geniuses at their craft. And if you think of the enemy as the conductor in a larger mad orchestra that's all about lulling the masses and controlling people and culling them into different areas, like a herd of sheep. When you start recognizing the mechanics of how this works, you can see someone like Strauss or Friedrich Nietzsche. You can see how they are merely instruments in a large orchestra of control. And it takes some of the fun out of the art, of appreciating it by recognizing this. But at the same time, you're also seeing it more for what it is on a larger scale. And you can appreciate the art, but also recognize how it's being used as a tool by the great oppressor. And you can recognize that certain entities like EMI or the Tavistock Institute, these think tanks, you can follow the money and see what money is funding it and who's putting the stuff out and who's promoting it. And you can make that connection and step back and go, oh, I see why they're funding this, because this is encouraging this type of behavior, these types of politics, this way of thought. Destroying Christianity is a theme going back, quite a few decades now. So, you don't have to hate the artists. You can appreciate the artists and their skill, but to also recognize how they're being used and the greater picture, that's the most important part. They call the tarot the fool's journey because the fool steps off a ledge and goes anywhere, but you don't want to be the fool necessarily. You don't want to just let the music lull you and guide you and to wherever it goes. You want to be, freedom means you're in control of your life. It doesn't mean you're just floating around at the whim of greater powers that, couldn't possibly have your, destruction in mind, right? So I'm going to get into this more in a future blog that I'm working on.